Okay. So again, welcome. I am going to use a PowerPoint presentation, and there's a lot of material that I want to present. We'll have a couple times for a little bit of discussion in the midst of the presentation, but we'll have hopefully a good amount of time at the end to sort of chew on the material and to ask questions and to really reflect on the material and how it relates to us today. So this is about the afterlives of slavery in Lawrence Township, and it really does have to do with, I think, moral choices around slavery. This was to remind me to record this session, and so we are indeed recording. So this is what I hope that we will accomplish in this brief time today and next week. My hope is that, of course, we're going to learn about slavery in a very particular context here in Lawrence Township, and how that affects, what effects that we might imagine has on our life today. Of course, the afterlife of slavery with racism and the relationship between people of color and whites. We're going to really focus too on the way people made moral decisions about slavery and what to do about slavery in this context here in Lawrence Township in the 19th century. And then, we might think about how does that inform our own moral decision making in our own time, in our own context, over the great moral questions of our own day. So another thing that I hope we'll encounter in this study is really what I encountered in doing this study. And again, I am no expert on the history of slavery. I'm not a historian. I'm a Presbyterian pastor, but who's done some study about slavery in Lawrence Township, because my congregation had a lot to do with the context of slavery. We're going to be talking about Liberia and the American Colonization Society. And what I discovered is it's very complex, much more complex than I learned in junior high, let's say. And of course, there's the concomitant complexity around making moral decisions about slavery, which I hope we'll begin to appreciate. So I put this slide here, oops, sorry, as just a maybe way to introduce that complexity. And so I want to ask you, what do you notice right away about this? It's a very disturbing image, but what do you notice right off the bat?
They're chained.
Sorry, say again.
They're chained.
They're chained. Yeah. What else might hit you right over the head about what's going on in this picture?
Well, look at who's leading them.
Yeah,
And what is that person carrying?
Right. So this is an illustration about, Black people enslaving Black people in Africa. So we might think, oh, Europeans introduced the practice of slavery, but it pre-existed them in Africa for many centuries. And so, that's a moral dimension that I think is tricky to talk about, but it's something that's important. And we could talk a lot about that, but that's just something that we're going to mention in this study together. So this is what we would call an inductive way of learning. And, when Sherlock Holmes says to Watson, Watson says, how'd you figure that out? And Sherlock Holmes says, sheer deduction. It's actually the opposite kind of logic. Inductive logic or inductive reasoning is, going from specific observations to general theories. So if you are learning Greek using an inductive method, you start by analyzing a sentence and then learning from analyzing that one sentence you learn about the rules of grammar. Whereas the deductive way of learning and reasoning is to go from general principles to the specific. So if you're learning Greek using that method, you learn all the rules of grammar and all of the vocabulary, and then you start diagramming and analyzing the specific sentences and so forth. So we're learning about slavery through the very specific context of this little town, and how people were thinking about slavery, and how that also impacted another part of the world that we're going to drill down on, namely Liberia. So again, the next week is going to be primarily about how people from this very congregation had a huge impact on a country that developed all the way around the world that became known as Liberia. So what are we going to be drilling down on today? We're going to talk about the first full-time pastor of this church, Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, and the Lawrenceville Church, which was called the Maidenhead Church back then. We're going to be talking about another context within Lawrence Township, Lawrenceville, namely Louisville Road, and the person after whom was named Lewis Phillips. Somebody might need to mute themselves. I'm hearing some background noise, so if you don't mind checking whether you're muted, that would be helpful. So these are the contexts today that we're going to be focusing on, and then next week, as I mentioned, we're going to talk primarily about Liberia. So let's begin by talking about Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, my most illustrious, famous predecessor. What do we know about him? We know that, of course, he was the first full-time pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Lawrenceville. Before that time, we certainly had pastors, but they were shared among several churches. Usually it was Lawrenceville, Pennington, and Trenton that shared a pastor, and transportation was slow, and so a pastor would only get to one church on a given Sunday, and they would rotate that way, but would get around to do the pastoral care, in this entire area. So imagine how challenging that would have been with transportation being what it was then. Presbyterians may have a little reputation of being cheap, but we do know that there wasn't quite enough to pay Isaac Van Arsdale Brown. It was a stretch. It was a risk to hire him. And so one of the ways that he sought to supplement his salary was raising silkworms. This was part of his previous education, I guess in primary school and college. He attended the College of New Jersey. But that didn't work. Raising silkworms was a bit of a failure. And so he started tutoring young boys. There were two families in the church. One had 4 boys and the other 5, and he started tutoring them in the meeting house. And thus the Lawrenceville School was born. He paid $30 a year to the church to use the sanctuary, the meeting house, for that purpose. Back in 1810, he founded the Lawrenceville School. So what else do we know about Isaac Van Arsdale Brown? Well, he was very theologically conservative, very conservative. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were 2 major theological rifts, divisions, fights. In the 18th century, it was the old side and new side controversy, and similar issues reared their ugly head in the 19th century, the old school, new school controversy and division. And so, the Great Awakening, the new school or new side was all about, having an emotional response to Christian faith, having an experience of new life. And so it was about revivalism and again, emotionality. And so the other side of that were people like Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, who were very suspicious of this emotional response to Christianity. What really matters is having the right understanding of Scripture and doing the right thing according to what Scripture teaches us. And having the right doctrine. So if you're coming before the Presbyterian, Isaac Van Arsdale Brown is there in the pews, he would ask you, do you have the right, the right doctrine, as opposed to, is Jesus your Lord and Savior, and have you been saved? That was kind of the nature of that controversy. So very theologically conservative. He wrote an entire book to justify his particular theological persuasion, but he was in some ways progressive on the social issue of slavery to an extent. He wrote an entire book against the practice of slavery. It may look, if you look at his records, it may look like he's written 2 books. It's the same book under a different title, but very, very careful scriptural analysis about why slavery is wrong. And he wrote against his colleagues at Princeton Seminary. Princeton Seminary was more aligned with the old school, the theologically conservative folks, but Some of them, like Charles Hodge, were apologists for slavery. A fallen world, we got to allow for it. The Bible says, it's practiced and so forth. So he wrote a book against slavery, but some people might think, oh, well, he was an abolitionist. Not so fast. He would not call himself in any way an abolitionist, and he saw them as a grave danger. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. So here is, one of the most famous abolitionists of the day, William Lloyd Garrison. He would be considered, looking back on, using our 2020 hindsight, he'd be a rock star for us because he had what is viewed today as the right moral position around this stuff. So we got to free the slaves now. So why might they have disagreed? Let me just ask, what ideas do you have about what the primary rub is about why these folks were on a different page when it came to slavery, and especially what to do about it? Any ideas? Yeah, go ahead, Janet. And I can't.
I think it has to do with whether or not you see people of color as being people. And the Constitution talks about how they are 3/5. And when we see people as people, then they are equals. But when we don't see them as people, they aren't.
Yeah, I would say people who disagreed with the abolitionists who were apologists for slavery may have had a little of that, but I don't know, Janet, that would be agreeable to Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, because he very much did see Black people as children of God and so forth. The disagreement involves something else about, again, how do you deal with if slavery is wrong? Okay, well, now what do we do about it?
Did he think that if slaves were going to be made free, that adjusting to life in America would be too challenging? Is that kind of where this is going?
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're absolutely on the right track. So adjusting to life without the institution of slavery, what do you imagine the fear was for Isaac Van Arsdale Brown and people like him who didn't want slavery? He didn't like slavery. It's totally against the Bible. It's wrong and evil. But what is the solution when slaves are free? What is that going to look like? I think you're on the right track. Any other ideas or yeah, Alicia?
I believe that I'd like, just to kind of continue with Carrie's thought, he would desire for the slaves to go back to where they came from, which is, I think, where the Liberia piece comes in, versus abolitionists would deal with it in the United States, and they would be free and they'd become a full citizen, and what would we do with them there? So I think the concern would be, how do we deal with this social issue, if we call it that, of many people being freed without having jobs or housing or a way to pay for their lifestyle?
Yeah, exactly right. That hits it right on the head, because the big fear of people in the 19th century was they're going to kill us, right? I'll talk a little more about that in just a minute, but the primary disagreement was over.
I'm sorry, I have a quick question, Jeff.
Yeah.
Was part of that, just kind of going on with what Alicia said, dealing with this issue, did he see people of color as, quote, needing to be cared for, needing to be taken care of, and that this was his way of doing that?
Yes, I think, yeah, the question would be, well, what are we going to do with all these folks who won't be able to function in our society, right? That's not going to work. And also, they're a great threat to the stability of our country. And so here's how they disagreed in many ways. They totally agreed on the wrongness of slavery, but they disagreed on the solution. And so they disagreed on this particular solution, especially the American Colonization Society. So I want to talk about that for a minute. what was the American Colonization Society? Well, the primary focus of that organization was to send free blacks, freed slaves back to Africa. Let's create a country and they can go back to where they came from. The founders, this has Presbyterian fingerprints all over it, especially those from the Princeton area. A lot of people from Princeton Seminary were way, way behind this idea. And Isaac Van Arsdale Brown was a founder and one of the leading lights and was on the national board of the American Colonization Society. He wrote the biography of Robert Finley, who is thought to be the father of the American Colonization Society. This is a great hero, is the founder of the ACS. And of course, responsible for the creation of Liberia. We're going to talk a little bit about that founding and how that all unfolded next week, primarily. Popular among moderates, so it was a good liberal position, you know, but not too radical. It was the right thing, but not too radical. And interestingly enough, and I'm going to pause here just for a second, it was supported both by those opposed to slavery, like Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, and Southern slaveholders. Now, let me just tease your brain a little bit and ask, why do you think that was? You know, Southern slaveholders and people against slavery were in league here on this solution. Why? Any ideas?
I would think that the people in the South who were enslavers didn't want free blacks around to, quote, give ideas to the people they were still enslaving.
Well, gold star to the fourth grade teacher. That's exactly right. You know, Southern slaveholders like, yeah, sure, send them back to Africa and they won't tempt our slaves to have any ideas about being free. And for the moderate liberal folk in the North who were anti-slavery, they thought, well, this is a gradual way of transitioning out of slavery, because eventually slavery is going to die out and we need an off-ramp for it. And the off-ramp is Liberia and colonization. So interestingly, Abraham Lincoln supported this solution for a time, and it's complicated and not quite clear exactly how much or how long or when, but he definitely supported it during a certain period of time. Yeah, Janet, you wanted to, and I'm sorry, I can't see all of your hands, you know, as I'm going along, but please, yeah, go ahead, Janet.
One of the problems is that the idea of sending them back to Africa, some of them had been in this country for 200 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And so back to, what do you mean?
Yeah.
My ancestors, you send me back to Scotland because my ancestors came from there, but I haven't lived in Scotland.
Yeah, this is my home. I've been here centuries. So this really only repopulated, and Bill Bowers probably knows that, I think about 13,000 blacks. And it was a way for slavery in the 19th century was then abolished, and the slave trade, it was a way to send blacks on slave ships that were illegal back to Africa and so forth. But yeah, you know, people from here, they had no concept of what it would be like to go back to Africa. So it was not popular at all among free blacks, for sure. Yeah. Again, the rationale for creating this solution was we can never live peaceably with them, and they are a threat to us. The ironic another rationale is ironic. It's like, well, they're going to kill us, but we're going to send them back to Africa because they're going to Christianize Africa. You know, we'll teach them to be good Christians, and then they can Christianize Africa, which actually they kind of did in many ways. So in a lot of ways that was a relative success in a way. And we're going to export our way of life, democracy, to the uncivilized land of the so-called dark continent. And then we're going to stop the slave trade there. We're going to talk about that and how that played among the people of Africa who were receiving these free blacks in this particular part of Africa, and what that did to their context and their country. So here's maybe just in case you don't believe me, there's some primary source material. This is from Isaac Van Arsdale's book, Slavery Irreconcilable with Christianity and Sound Reason. And it's also under another title, something like White Diamonds Are Better Than Black Diamonds or something like that. He writes, abolitionists are quite as much mistaken in supposing that they would lead peaceable, orderly, and quiet lives and suffer their recent owners to enjoy a safe, tranquil, and happy abode in the midst of them. That's Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, and why abolitionists are dangerous radicals, because they're going to kill us. On the other hand, here is William Lloyd Garrison, a rock star, and his book against the American Colonization Society and his writing is well worth reading. But here's his words. Somebody may honestly do mischief and not be aware of his error. So people who are advocating this, they may be good people and thinking they're doing good things, but they are laboring under a delusion and verily believing that they are doing God's service. But I blame them for feeling so indifferent to the moral, political, and social advancement of the free people of country in this, their only legitimate home. So he was well ahead of his time in making what we would consider the right moral choice about slavery. But this was considered by most a dangerously radical solution to free all the slaves and let's help them improve their lives. It's interesting to note. All right, so you're gonna get some relief from my droning on and my voice, and we're gonna listen to an interview with Jackie Hahn. So this is about 12 minutes. We're right about on track, I think. She is the archivist and a librarian at the Lawrenceville School and was charged with the task of doing some historical research as kind of part of, it's not exactly a slavery audit for the Lawrenceville School, but it's the beginnings of that. And she found some very interesting things in her research that she's going to talk about. So here's Jackie Hahn. I need to make sure that I have shared this in the right way, because I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and I'm going to start sharing again to make sure that I have optimized for video. Here we go.
I am the school archivist, which means in a general sense, I'm responsible for taking care of all of the records of the school, in historical records and modern records, dating back to 1810. And I'm also the person who, when we have questions about school history, they turn to me, although I do not have much in the way of historical training. But as an archivist and as a librarian, I'm a fairly skilled researcher. So I've been able to piece together things, and then also consulting with history faculty on campus or off campus as well. I can start to put together a narrative. And we became interested in this topic initially because we had students who asked us about rumors that some of our property, particularly the football practice fields, which is known as Greenfield, on Main Street along the wrought iron fencing right across from Greenhouse, whether those were in fact, quote, slave fields. And we had never heard any information at all connecting the school to slavery. So we started investigating, trying to understand who had owned the property before we did, and found that the Green family, who lived, some of whom lived in Greenhouse and also lived on Cherry Grove Farm, and who were very prominent local people, had owned slaves, like throughout their entire history here, and until well at, not really long time after the school was founded, but probably another 20 years afterwards. So that's how we started looking into this subject, and it's still very much a work in progress. The more we find, the more we realize we don't know in detail.
The focus of this conversation is in general slavery as it relates to the school, but in particular the founder of the school, Isaac Van Arsdale Brown. And just briefly, I'm fascinated by this guy. He's the most famous of my predecessors, but there's very little known about him really outside of the books that he wrote. You've done a lot of primary research on things. What can you tell us about his personality in general?
Well,
Was he
I'm
like?
faced with the same challenge as you are as far as lack of resources. The only thing we have that we can add a little bit to the picture are quotes from his previous students from that time period, and there aren't very many of those. But one that is often quoted was from Dr. Samuel Gross, who was one of the early surgeons in Philadelphia, who's best known as the subject of a painting known as the Gross Clinic. That if you Google that online, you'll find out a lot more detail about that. But when Dr. Gross was here, he attended between 1822 and 1825, so about a decade after Brown had started the school. And he described him as a sincere Christian and a good man, a little too fond of the birch, for he would occasionally flog some of the younger boys most unmercifully. And then he further explained that at that time period, boys were expected to attend church regularly, and he characterized Dr. Brown's sermons as often fatiguingly long and uninteresting. He was someone who cared very much about doing the right thing in the sense of understanding what the Lord willed and what the Lord wanted people to do through the Bible, because he did start the local Bible Society and is well known for that, and spoke often about the importance of teaching boys from the Bible as a guiding light. I think that mattered very much to him. But I do think it might have made him a little more rigid and rule bound and disciplinarian than today's Christians might necessarily
We should
see.
remind people if they complain about a 20-minute sermon that Dr. Brown preached 1 hour plus sermons. So yeah, he was a very conservative guy theologically, but in some ways had some progressive view of slavery for his time in a certain context. I'd love for you to talk more about generally what you found out about slavery in part 2 of this interview, because we're trying to keep it to about 10 minutes or so. But say more about his relationship to slavery and how that might have compared with others in the area and their view of slavery.
Well, he was born in 1784 in Plaquemine, New Jersey, which is Somerset County, actually Bedminster now. And he grew up in a slave-owning family. He was well off enough to be sent to Princeton and graduated from Princeton in 1802. He had several relations that were also pastors. And these same relations all owned slaves as well. So he very much grew up in a culture where Christianity and slave ownership was not in conflict. So I found it very interesting that we did find, by looking at the old manumission records, that he had at one point himself owned a slave, which was news to us. This is never mentioned anywhere else. But the situation is interesting because the record we have is a manumission record for a woman named Elsie, who was released when she turned 21 in 1822. And those dates are important because the law that mandated that slaves be released was first passed in 1804. And the laws directed people that when an enslaved woman had a baby, that baby would be registered. And if you were a female baby, you were enslaved for only 21 years, and then the owner was obligated to release you. If you were a male child, you would be released at 25. But this only applied to babies born after July 4th, 1804. So for Elsie to be released in 1822 at the age of 21, which would have been the customary age for a woman to be released under the law didn't actually apply to her. So it seems to us that Reverend Brown had made a decision to release this woman under what he understood the intent of the law was, even though the law did not apply to her. Now, we don't know how he came to have Elsie. The records for that time period do not exist in New Jersey. So we don't know. Were there other slaves that just aren't reflected in the record?
Yeah.
We
So we
can't
do know
say.
that he owned a slave and released that person before the law required him to do. Say a little bit, we have another minute or two left until we go to a part two. Let's say a little bit about, so here he was owning a slave, but he became ardently anti-slavery. He had a very particular solution that is part of this course, the American Colonization Society. But say a little bit about what you found out about others' perspectives on slavery and how that compared to their perspective, say people also from the seminary and so forth. What was going on there?
The seminary in particular tended to be a bit more conservative. And I know that you can speak much more to the details of the theology beyond, for this thinking, but I do know that there seemed to be something going on locally because a lot of people who had been slave owners started releasing their slaves in the late teens, 1820s, 1830s. Richard Montgomery Green, who started this quest for us, who lived across the street, owned several slaves, released them, and we're told, and still trying to confirm the details, that they went to live on Lawrenceville Road as free people. So we'd love to know what the impetus was for this shift from slave ownership being common and accepted among pious people to this change of at least releasing them, even if there are details on what would happen to them afterwards.
Well, so it's interesting, I mean, one of the themes of this particular class is the complexity around the issue of slavery and a moral response to it. And so, here's a guy who is really conservative theologically, super conservative, and in many other ways. And yet there were other people, even though there were some trends toward releasing slaves, there were also, the common view is it was okay. Charles Hodge, the seminary, is like, it's a fallen world. We need to tolerate slavery and so forth. So it's really interesting that, his ardent anti-slavery wasn't necessarily that easy of a moral position to take. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. In some ways, it was so pervasive and so acceptable at the time. I mean, Robert Finley, about whom he wrote a biography, a very, very admiring biography, also was a slave owner. And it's like, it's in some sense, the book is a hagiography, and yet there's still this very noticeable to us disconnect from our perspective. And Finley, of course, goes on to found the American Colonization Society. And I don't know that it had been understood until recently that he was also a slave owner, like before he made this decision. He had actually released 2 of his slaves shortly before his death. So it's interesting to try to suss out what was happening with these people to make these huge changes.
Yeah.
But they were it's really surprising to me now that I understand how comprehensive it was in the culture, that Reverend Brown would have come to this decision. He easily could have just said, it's good enough as it is. We don't need to, make any shift.
So it's really, I find all of that very fascinating, and I hope that for you, it might add a lot of subtlety and complexity to the picture about what was going on with slavery, using this very, very narrow context of one person and his view of slavery. He owned a slave named Elsie. He founded the Lawrenceville School in 1810. He manumitted her in 1821. So he owned a slave when he was a headmaster of the Lawrenceville School. And he was an ACS member, a founding member of an organization that was formed in 1816. We need to pause here just for a minute to say this is something that is also new to the student body of the Lawrenceville School, and I'm sure is going to entail some controversy because for students of color especially to learn that the founding headmaster owned slaves is not something that's going to require some careful handling. Of course, if that's the only headline, then of course we don't do justice to this complexity, which is really what I think this little course is all about. So we're going to get to some discussion, but I want to spend a little bit of time about the context of the church and Louisville Road. So shout out to Bill Bowers, who did a lot of primary research on some of this material, but we do know that many members of the Lawrenceville Church owned slaves. Here are some of the names. They may seem familiar to many of us. Famous families from this church in this town. They owned slaves. There were also slaves and freed slaves. Both free Blacks and slaves who were members of the Lawrenceville Church. So, for example, according to Dr. Hunter's research, from 1808 to 1849, about 20 Blacks were listed in the rolls among the 350 other members. Again, many slaves of the members were members at PCOL, as well as free slaves. So what was going on, as I said, many owned slaves, but they were also members of and supporters of the American Colonization Society. So we have our fingerprints all over the creation of the country of Liberia, this church. They gave money to it. They believed in it, at least for a time, but it's murky as to exactly what people thought of it as the 19th century unfolded. Lewis Phillips, we're going to talk about him as we end here, owned slaves and joined the ACS in the 1820s. And as Jackie mentioned, Richard Green was also an officer of the ACS. So to end, I want to talk a little bit about Louisville Road and why it's called Louisville Road. It's named after Lewis W.R. Phillips, who was a lawyer in this town. And for those of you who might not know where Louisville Road is, it's right here. I guess that would be the eastern side of the Lawrenceville School. Here's Franklin Corner Road. There's the orthodontist and stuff. And so we're talking about this other side of Louisville Road. So who was Lewis W.R. Phillips? This is not his photograph. I thought it maybe kind of looks like him. It might help imagine him. So Louisville Road, again, was named after Lewis W.R. Phillips. Lived on the eastern side of 206, north of Cold Soil Road. Attended Princeton University, well-educated person. Died in 1855. So he was also an elder and trustee at the church. He is from a slave-owning family, and he owned slaves himself. He joined the ACS in the 1820s, and he freed his slaves in the 1820s. These are all data points that we know. And so we're left with imagining around these data points who this person might have been. It's a very interesting story because we also know that some of his former slaves continued to live with him in his house after they had been freed. And we wonder if maybe he changed his mind about the ACS, and maybe because Black people largely rejected that as a solution to slavery. Because let's talk about why the Louisville Road was named that. Why did they name that road after him? Very interesting that Lewis W.R. Phillips, rather than encouraging Blacks to go back to Africa via the ACS's solution, he encouraged them to settle in Lawrenceville, and he actually sold land and houses at a fraction of their value on what came to be known as Louisville Road. Very interesting. And we could talk a little bit about the people who are members at the Lawrenceville Church formed their own AME Zion Church off of Louisville Road. So we think probably those Free Blacks formed their own church on Louisville Road and largely then left the Lawrenceville Church. But it's interesting to think about, during the early part of the 19th century, this church was more integrated than it is today. So 10 families lived on Louisville Road in the early part of the 19th century. So questions for discussion. I'm just going to stop my sharing for a moment and leave those questions and pause to ask what questions you might have about that material before we turn to some other questions to discuss.
Jeff, this is Don Weigel. Can you hear me okay?
You're great.
Okay. In terms of the drilling down aspect of this and questions that were raised in the video that we saw, how much do people know about Van Arsdale Brown's family before there was a person who became the pastor? But my thinking is that many of the people of wealth in those days, even when they were in the North, accepted slavery in where they were because they knew that they could be benign to those people and nothing terrible would happen to them as they might have known happened in the South. And also, many of those people derived their wealth from doing business with plantation owners. And so to speak about abolishing slavery would be likely to cut into their wealth, if not dissolve it. So, just letting my mind wander, I thought that perhaps Reverend Brown, as you've talked about, maybe came to this area knowing only what he knew about his ability to be here and to do the things he did because his family was wealthy and maybe didn't even question slavery. And so you asked for questions. I'm questioning whether there's any real historiography relating to his ancestors, his forebears, and how they derived their wealth. And I promise only to say this and then I'll listen, but I also think that Louisville Road may have been named that way because that person communicated with the people around him on a first name basis. He didn't need to be Master Phillips or anything like that. And that quite possibly his reasoning for wanting to free his slaves and not have them move away would be because he wasn't concerned about how they would get along in the outside society, because he was a major shaker in the society they were going to live in. And so long as he was alive, these people had a right to expect that they would be treated with dignity. Those are just some things I thought.
I think, your question answers itself, because I mean, based on my meager understanding of Isaac Van Arsdale Brown's family and what little we know, they were a slave owning family. And so you're right, all the privileges that would have accrued from owning slaves and being part of that economy helped Isaac Van Arsdale Brown get to where he got. And so maybe also we're looking at moral decision making. It might not have been so easy for him to take an anti-slavery position because of that. And I just appreciate your conjecturing about Lewis Phillips and his relationship to those people who settled on Louisville Road. So I'm going to call on Bill Bowers. He deserves, I think, again, a shout out for some of the work that he's done and contributed to some of the historical research that was used in this presentation. Bill, do you know anything about Isaac Van Arsdale Brown's family that might shed light on that?
Well, to continue with one of the themes, it's complicated. his family were originally French Huguenots. They came from, I think, Nantes and originally. They migrated when the Huguenots were expelled, pardon, from France to Staten Island, which in those days was heavily Dutch influenced, and the Dutch were for reasons that I don't understand, very conservative slaveholders. His family itself, he then, as Jackie Hahn mentioned, his father moved to Somerset County. I don't believe he was wealthy, that is, his family, the way we would think of wealth today. It was more prosperous, but it was not uncommon for preachers, including, as I think Jackie also said, Robert Finley. Robert Finley's father also owned slaves. They used them in their work, and a lot of them were actually handed down from father to son. So it's quite possible, although I don't know this, it's quite possible that Elsie was bequeathed to Van Arsdale Brown.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the theories that Jackie was trying to pursue and figure out, are there any primary records that would point to that? And it's not, it's not clear, but it's so interesting that you have this data point. You can't dispute that he must have owned a slave because there's this manumission record, but you don't know anything about the context or circumstances. So I want to turn to, well, are there any other general questions about the presentation? Because I've got some other stuff for us to chew on, if not. So I'm just curious as to how this strikes you and whether it does complexify. I guess I think that's a word. You know, problematize is a big word these days among scholars. When we have too easy an understanding of something, we think we understand it, and then, oh, well, all of a sudden there's all this other stuff. It makes it seem much more complex. Anyway, what was your experience in learning about this material?
Well, I said I wouldn't say anymore, but I guess nobody else wants to talk. So here I am again. I welcome this kind of looking at our heritage, our past through a different lens. Without belaboring the point, I was an undergraduate history major, and so I've read more than maybe most about some of these issues. And just by the way, I commend anybody who's interested further to look further into the 1619 project, which was a product of Time magazine 3 years ago, but is now being documented visually through a series that will look at a perspective that 1619, when people think is the appearance of the first slave ship here, was a more important date in our history than 1776. And so the 1619 project examines our history through the perspective of what that did from a Black person's perspective. And so to get more to the point, I came to learn early on that, yes, history is written by the winners and hindsight is always clearer. And so I think it's easy for people as it is to watch a football game and then on Monday know what you would have done if you had been calling plays and so forth. So I think it's very worthwhile for us as a people, as a congregation, as human beings, to examine what people may know that was not known, or at least was maybe known but was never allowed to reach the light of day. And so I welcome this session and I thank you. And I look forward to the next session. And I actually have a hope that there may be other sessions beyond that, because I know, Jeff, you don't have anything else to do.
Well, we're gonna keep, next week, we're gonna begin with this material. And we're gonna talk about how this informs us about our own thinking about moral choices. Not just on an individual level. Should I steal, somebody's pointing a gun and asking me, where is my daughter or something, and should you lie? Not that kind of moral decision making, but about the great moral issues socially. So anyway, Janet, you have your hand up. What do you have to say?
Yes, one of the books that I read recently is What Kind of Christianity, that looks at the American history of slavery. And in it, it talks about Jacob Green. And I don't know if he was part of the Green family. He was a contemporary of Witherspoon and was vice president of the College of New Jersey in the 1812 to 1823. But Jacob Green saw the Revolutionary War as a cause for emancipation of slaves as well. So he was very definitely anti-slavery, even in the 1770s. And that, I think, is a different understanding of the Revolutionary War. My hope is that all of this will help us think about how we move forward in a country that is still dealing with racism.
Yeah, well, amen. Well, I'm going to ditch this next question and insert one that impromptu like here. So there were sort of two basic positions here. I mean, there are really three. One is, oh, slavery's fine. It's okay because the Bible says it's okay. Another is Isaac Van Arsdale Brown saying, no, slavery isn't okay, but we're not going to be able to live with those people, so let's send them back to Africa. And then you've got William Lloyd Garrison saying, no, this is a moral scourge and we must free them right now and do everything we can to integrate them into our society. Now, here's a hard question. And we'll ruminate on this for a few minutes and then close. But knowing you and where you are, what do you think your choice would be? It's not an easy question, I think. Which side would you be on? So, Bill, you're muted.
Yeah, phone was ringing, sorry. I do have a lot of sympathy for the American Colonialization Society and those advocates in the North who believe that by and large blacks were equal to whites, but that the country that they lived in simply could not accept that. And that was true for Philadelphia from the locals' own experience. The moderation did seem to be a effort to literally save people's lives. Originally, after the rebellion in Haiti, the whites were afraid the slaves would revolt. In the 1850s, there was a great concern that if the blacks weren't sent to Africa or someplace, there would be a great civil war and hundreds of thousands of people would die. And of course, that's what happened.
That's what happened. Yeah,
the worst fears of the ACS were realized.
yeah, yeah.
700,000 people, including 150,000 civilians.
And
That-
yet,
that,
which position
that-
is history vindicated? That, you know, ACS people might have been right, but what do we think is right from the point of view of today, looking back?
Well,
Does anybody here want to say, oh, we shouldn't have freed the slaves and fought a civil war? Maybe.
Oftentimes we try and hide things that we're not proud of, sweep it under the carpet. And I wonder if sending them back to Liberia, thereby, oh, we don't have to face our problems. We'll just sweep it under the carpet and remove it from our eyesight so that we won't have to look at it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Might be interesting to, like, what if it had succeeded? What would it be like? And what would success have meant? Yeah. Well, as we end here, a few things to think about before next week. One is, as we think about, okay, looking back, you could say that Isaac Van Arsdale Brown and the people supporting the ACS, their assumptions were horribly racist. The idea that we will never be able to live with Black people in this country. And that's an easy judgment for us to make from the convenient point of view of now looking back. But what would we have done? I probably would have been an advocate for the ACS, back then. But how does that inform our own moral decision-making today about the great issues that we face? What will people in another couple of generations say about us, right? Oh, they ate meat. They ate animals back then. Or, oh, they just kept burning coal until the earth was whatever. And where do we stand as individual people around those issues? And maybe we have good liberal positions on them, but are they radical enough? That's one big, long question. It's like, how does this inform our thinking about some of the really thorny issues today, and how far are we willing to be uncomfortable in making moral choices around them? But then the second thing is, what might Scripture invite us? What scriptures might be helpful in our thinking, in guiding our thinking about this? Yeah, Kyle, maybe you want to weigh in today about that. Yeah.
Well, I confess I was only half paying attention to what you were just saying, because I was thinking about the previous question also. And
It's not a new thing, Kyle.
yeah. Well, the thing I was thinking about is I was thinking of an experience that I had in Israel, and traveling between Hebron and small Israel settlement in the West Bank, and talking with a woman who really was just a Jewish, a citizen of Israel living in a settlement in the West Bank. She really wasn't a part of this educational experience. We had this other tour guide who she knew, but it was really unique. I got to sit on the bus by chance. The two of us were sharing a seat in the back of the bus, and I was talking with her about, in Israel, they have different sections. They're kind of rated. And when you're driving through the West Bank, and, and I remember talking with her, and she had this very real fear that all Palestinians were violent people, and maybe not all of them were terrorists, but they were violent people, and that she had this very real fear for her life. And so I was thinking, in the context of this, I mean, we know Isaac Van Arsdale Brown believed, right? We had what he's written, that, how could freed Black slaves possibly live in peace with people who've enslaved them, or how could they not incite rebellion? How could they, not incite violence? And that was true for him. But, the question I have is, where does that information come from, right? And I think of our lives today, we often formulate our opinions based on, the news channels that we watch or the articles that we read or the, and somewhere, someone, I think, puts together a narrative that is usually out of self-interest or benefits a particular group of people. And then generally speaking, people with the best of intentions, people of faith, people of good character, then develop their own sort of perspectives. And so I am like trying to process this whole idea of who was Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, and how did he come to that conclusion? What was the narrative there? Because even, at the point when he wrote about slavery had long since been abolished in the North. The American Colonization Society had long since been established. He had long since freed his slaves. And it was more an argument, I think, against the South. But I'm just curious, more interested in the earlier years. I'm just rambling at this point, but I'm just very curious about where does that narrative come from that freed slaves are clearly going to be violent people, and how does that become so internalized? And what maybe that goes to your question: what are we guilty of that of today? What will people say about us later?
I can answer that quickly. It came first from Haiti, where there was a bloody revolution, but also from a series of slave revolts that were small, but scared the slaveholders to death in Virginia, in Tennessee, in the south of the U.S.
Yeah. Anyway, so interesting. I was only half listening because I was thinking of what I'm going to say, Kyle, there. No, just kidding. Actually, I think that's very well said. And what an interesting context to compare it to what's going on in Israel, Palestine. It's there are many parallels there. Yeah. And you're right. It's sort of like very, very interesting, especially maybe for us as clergy here. What was this guy like who was occupying the same pulpit, and what motivated him and so forth? But that's what we're trying to find out. And Jackie's continuing to do more research. Oh yeah. So sorry, Carrie, I didn't. Oh
no, I just put it up. Just thinking about like what future generations are going to judge us for.
Yeah.
And like the things that you mentioned, like thinking about guns, like shame on future generations if they don't judge us for that.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I hope they judge us for that.
Right. Yeah. And, the other thing for me is like, maybe I have the kind of right position, but am I radical enough? I mean, that's another thing. So those are some questions to leave us with. And we're going to kind of pick up where we left off next week. But the primary focus next week is going to be, well, okay, here's this little town in New Jersey, which had this huge effect on the creation of another country halfway across the world. What happened there? Stay tuned. That'll be where we pick up next week, as we also continue to deal with these questions about moral choice. All right. So everybody have a great weekend and rest of the week, and we'll see you next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.